Just to go through very quickly, historically, the changing nature of racism in capitalist society from its inception. Look at the way in which racism has adapted itself in different circumstances to play a different, well, sometimes a slightly different role, but how it has also always been a fixture of capitalist society. And I guess what I'm going to try and do is to lay out a Marxist analysis of racism, a materialist analysis of racism, where it comes from, how it operates, and its relationship to the working class, and the question of change, which is obviously inherent within that. Because obviously over this week or so, you know, I don't know about you, but I had a sort of a complete blitz of stuff on Facebook about this, that, and the other, and so on and so forth. And what a lot of the comments, which I can kind of understand, have not really addressed is what is the nature of racism in capitalist society. What exactly is its role? Why is it such a, if you like, an enduring fixture? What is the relationship between racism and the working class? What's the relationship between the ruling class and racist ideas, and who benefits from it? That's really, I guess, been kind of missing from it. And obviously, as I go through, you'll hopefully begin to see the changing nature of racism, which is what this talk is all about. And I want to kind of throw out some kind of frameworks and some areas of Marxist analysis, which hopefully then we can have a discussion maybe around what's happening at the moment and find a path through. And I want to start with by saying that when it comes to racism, not just fighting racism, but actually analysing racism and its nature, actually Marxists and people who've been allied with the Marxist tradition have made have studied this and talked about and analysed it in depth. It's a huge part of the Marxist tradition, the question of racism, where it comes from, how do we fight it. Absolutely central part of the Marxist tradition. And along the way, all sorts of very, very powerful and interesting figures have contributed to that debate. So it's never been a marginal question for Marxists. It's always been central to the Marxist analysis of society and how to change it. So in the spirit of that, I really want to start with Karl Marx himself and Capital Volume 1. Now, Capital Volume 1, I don't know how many people have read it or flicked through it, but if you look at Capital Volume 1, it's extraordinary. It's not a bunch of figures and formulas and things like that. Really, it's a story. It's a story about the origins of capitalism. And all the way through it are examples around the question of exploitation. And real concrete examples, like, for example, marginalised communities in the Scottish lochs, who were forced, because of industrialisation, to scavenge on the shores of the lochs for whatever they could find to eat. If you read Capital Volume 1, you get a real textured understanding of the origins of capital. And along the way, or as part of the beginnings of that story, Marx talks about slavery, about the African slave trade, the transportation of vast millions of enslaved Africans from the west coast of Africa across the Atlantic into the Caribbean and into the slave colonies in the southern states of Northern America. And what he basically, I paraphrase it, but what he basically says is that if you look at what he called primitive accumulation, in other words, the kind of, if you like, the rocket fuel that actually started the capitalist mode of production in human society, he pinpoints it exactly at the point by which the West began to, if you like, colonize other parts of the world and began to move people from one part of the world to the other. So he basically says in Capital Volume 1, if the rosy dawn of capitalism, he's being ironic, as Marx tended to be sometimes, he says that the rosy dawn of capitalism, what you see is the if you like, the pillage of the gold mines of Southern America, Vasco da Gama, and then the Spanish invasion of South America, the extinction of the people who had that raw material, and then he said the turning of Africa into a warren for the hunting of black skins. That's Marx in Capital Volume 1. And what he says is this, is that actually these slave labour, which the colonists who grew the tobacco and the sugar plantations on the eastern seaboard of North America, the slavery which it rested on produced super profits, which actually kick-started capitalism. And a man called Eric Williams, who was a historian, who was the first president of Trinidad and Tobago post-independence. He wrote a very famous book called Capitalism and Slavery, and he based himself on Marx's kind of analysis of, if you like, the beginnings of industrial capitalism and accumulation of profit and what it meant right at its very beginning, in other words, enslavement of black Africans. And he said, actually, if you look at the profits from slavery, from the Caribbean, and from particularly for the Caribbean in terms of the British, it then fed its way into the Industrial Revolution. So people who began to, the inventions that we all learn about at school, the steam engine, Watt's steam engine, and so on and so forth, the growth of industrial capitalism in Birmingham rested upon the profits of slavery and the slave trade. So you can see, if you like, the way right at the beginning of industrial capitalism, how slavery played that particular part. And what Williams said was this, because he asked himself the question, what came first? Was it racism or was it the slavery? And what Eric Williams said was, look, the plantation owners, the slave owners, would have gone anywhere. They would have gone to the moon to find a labour which they could enslave, which would provide them with vast profits. But they didn't have to go that far. All they had to do was cross the Atlantic to the western seaboard of Africa and West African countries, and, if you like, steal black slaves from there. He said, and after that, as a justification of that, became an ideology which we know today as slavery. In other words, if you like, the economic impulse was there to rationalise it, to be able to enslave a fellow human being. What you had to do was you had to say, well, these people aren't really people at all. You can see the way in which that a racist ideology then begins to grow, because when you say that a person isn't really a person, or a person is not worth as much as another person, then it means that you can do anything you want with them and to them, right? That was right there at the root. And Eric Williams said that's what came first, was the economic impulse for super profits, and then the racist ideology which was constructed to then justify it. Because if you think about it, the American War of Independence and so on and so forth was based on the notion that all men were created equal. But so how then could you actually enslave another human being? You could only do it by saying, actually, that's not a human being. Really, I can trade that particular animal as if they were a piece of cattle or a herd of sheep or whatever it might be. So in other words, if you look at Marx, then you look at Williams, you can see by the way in which, if you like, racism was right there, right in the origins of industrial capitalism, and not marginal to it, but central to it, and central to the operation of profit gathering. If we then look, if you like, to the next phase of capitalist accumulation, if you look to imperialism and colonialism, you can see in which, if you like, racism, having been shaped as a tool by the ruling classes to extract super profit out of slaves and to justify it, then plays a role in imperialism and colonisation. Notion that we can colonise these places, we can take the raw resources out of it, because these people really aren't as civilised as us. And actually, even today, when you think about it, when you think about the kind of justifications for intervening in the Middle East and so on and so forth, you can see remnants of that theory, really, or that notion, that idea that really we know better than these people, we are the height of human civilization, we have a duty, as Rudyard Kipling would say, the white man's burden, to actually go there and to subjugate these people and to teach them really how to be civilized human beings like us. Usually at the point of the gun and a huge bloodshed, but, you know, we know that. We know that's a history of imperialism, but that's not the way that it was put forward by the ruling class, clearly. They constructed a whole other, if you like, racist rationale for colonialism and imperialism. And what I think is interesting about, what it's useful to realise about racism is that although, if you like, racism plays different roles in different periods of history, which is to do with, if you like, the mode of capital accumulation, as Marxists might say. In other words, what kind of society it is in which it's operating, in which it's being used, in which it's a tool, in one sense. Although there are, you can say, well, slavery, you had the racism of slavery, and then you had the racism of empire, and now we have the racism of divide and rule, which I'll come on to in a minute. Actually, within these different, they're not distinct periods. In other words, they borrow one from another. So although racism, obviously by the mid-19th century, wasn't used by the West to justify slavery, because slavery had been abolished for various reasons, some of which I'll talk about in a minute if I get time. Actually, the notion that actually there are such things as inferior races, in other words, there are people who may be human, but not quite as fully developed as you or I. In other words, there's some kind of hierarchy. You can see the way that played a role in the colonial and imperialist, firstly colonial imperialist expansion. And even during that period of colonial and imperialist expansion, you began to have the forced or a push of movements of people by colonisation, by the colonial masters. Groups of people were pushed to different parts of the world. So, for example, my father's forebears came to Trinidad in the middle of the 19th century after the abolition of slavery, because when the slaves liberated themselves and slavery was abolished in the mid-19th century, they said, there's absolutely no way we're going to work on a master's plantation anymore. We're going to go off. We're going to have our own farms. We're going to and feed ourselves. There's no way we're going to work as if we were still slaves on the master's sugar plantations. So what did the British do? Because there's a labour shortage in Trinidad, and this goes to places like Mauritius, Fiji, Jamaica as well, other parts of the Caribbean, which is affected by the end of slavery. The British said, okay, let's find, if you like, a surplus population from one part of the empire, and let's transport them to Trinidad, or to Fiji, or to Jamaica, or to Mauritius. And what they did was, there was a population, which for various reasons, very much to do with the operation of the British in India, there are massive surplus populations, in other words, people who couldn't feed themselves, people who have been pushed into the cities from agrarian areas in the north of India, who are then loaded, either coerced or shoved onto ships and then transported down to the Caribbean. And they became indentured labour. In other words, they had to work for 7 years for free for the boss. After 7 years, they could go back to India, or they could get a plot of land in Trinidad. Some went back and some stayed. And some of those that stayed were my father's forebears. So you can see, even within colonial and imperialist period, you can see there were the forced movements of people. East Africa is another example. Kenya, Uganda, Malawi. How did the Indians end up in those places? How did the Chinese end up in America in the 19th century to build the railways and so on and so forth? Same actually for Indians in East Africa to build the railways and so on and so forth. And what the British did was they used a very clever divide and rule. So they brought Indian labour in for a particular purpose. When they remained after that purpose, they took some of that Indian population, they educated them, and they gave them jobs in the bureaucracy. So therefore, they filled, if you like, an intermediary class in East Africa, in Kenya, between African labourers, the African working class, and rural people who lived in rural areas, and British rule. They became administrators of British rule, or they became small businessmen and opened up shops and stores and so on and so forth. They became an object of resentment for the African masses in places like Kenya and other places in East Asia, because they were seen as being favoured by the British. Really, the Indians were being used by the British, but the Africans thought that they perceived them as being favoured by the British and resentful of them. So when you got independence in the late 1960s and early 1970s in East Africa, in Kenya, Uganda and Malawi, what did the Africanising, newly independent leaders do? They basically kicked out the Asians. So you can see and if you look actually in America in the 19th century, the role of the Chinese railway workers or ex-workers on the railways was to try and undermine, was used by the bosses as a reservoir of labour which could undermine US workers, undermine their conditions. They would use them as strike breakers, the bosses would use them as strike breakers and so on and so forth. So even during the colonial period, you can see that the bosses understood that there was a role of divide and rule that could be, if you like, propagated or encouraged between different groups of workers according to their ethnicity or their origin or their supposed race. So even during that period, you can see the way that, if you like, it was a kind of test bed. Various parts of the world were test beds for where different groups of migrant labourers would be implanted into a working class and then be used as a tool of divide and rule in one way or another. And what was the purpose of this? It was clearly to pacify the working class as a whole. In other words, if they were fighting amongst themselves, they wouldn't be fighting for the bosses. If they thought that the Indians in Kenya were getting a better deal, they take it out on the Indians. They wouldn't look at the British administrators who are making the super profits, who are really running the country and taking all the decisions and so on and so forth. So that actually, what I'm trying to say, I guess, is that even in other periods of capitalist accumulation in terms of industrialization of the whole of the globe, and so on and so forth. Even during these periods, slavery, imperialism, colonialism, and so on and so forth, actually you could see the way in which modern forms of racism were already being tested out and invented, even in those periods. Now, if we come to this industrial capitalism, very interesting. Karl Marx again. He looks at Irish workers in this country in the 19th century, in places like Manchester and Liverpool and north of England particularly. And he says that the antagonism of the English worker towards the Irish worker is a secret of the British working classes' passivity in the faces of the bosses' attacks. In other words, the way in which the Irish migrant labour was regarded by the English worker was actually a secret of their impotence. In other words, their non-ability to fight back. That's in the kind of slums and the industrialised areas, particularly the north of England. Marx said, look, this is the problem, is when the British worker, the English worker, is pitted against the Irish worker and vice versa, when the Irish worker has looked at the source of the English worker's problems, who gets away scot-free. So you can see even Marx in this later period, actually, he's still looking at, if you like, the operation of racism within capitalism and the question of accumulation of profits. Now, very interesting, because I think we've talked, and Charlie touched on this notion of contradictory consciousness. Even though during that period, when Irish workers were being scapegoated by English workers in the industrial heartlands in England, even at the same time, English workers were supporting the blacks in the United States of America who are trying to free themselves from slavery. Even same workers, actually, if you think about it. So workers in the north of England could hate Irish workers for undermining their wages, but at the same time they could support, if you like, the north against the south in the American Civil War. So you found like mill workers in the north of England would support the abolition of slavery, even if it meant actually it would affect their jobs, because cheap cotton coming out of the slave states in the southern states of America was the reason why there were mills in the north of England. That was their raw produce. So they supported, if you like, the abolition of slavery during Americans and the North during the American Civil War, even though it seemed to be against their direct interest to do so. This is exactly the same time as they could be seen to be scapegoating the Irish. So you can see the way in which, if you like, these things could go in two directions. In fact, Marx was so buoyed up by the fact that the English working class actually supported the abolition of slavery during the American Civil War, that it actually motivated him to take an interest in practical politics in this country for the first time in decades. Because he thought it was the English workers' finest moment. That's what he said. So you can see in which, if you like, racism has the ability to divide, but also the working class can be seen as being the most consistent opponents of racism at the same time, even though it may be seen as being in their direct interests. Now, when I was growing up, there was a man called Enoch Powell. And to be honest, Farage is a very, very pale imitation of Enoch Powell. Because quite frankly, to be honest, if you lived during the era of the late 1960s and 1970s, Powell was like the devil. I mean, he really, really was. Every time he opened his mouth, you know that someone would die on the streets of East London. And he knew what he was doing. And he was unashamed about it. Now, interesting thing to think about Enoch Powell. If you read his speeches during the late 1960s and early 1970s, particularly the Rivers of Blood speech he made in April 1968, he doesn't say we should get rid of West Indians because they're a race. He says we should get rid of West Indians because their culture is not the same as ours. Really, they're incompatible with the English way of life, whatever that was. So he would say, they make too much noise. They forced this poor woman out of her house because they hold parties at night. Or mixed race kids who are the issue of mixed relationships, black and white in Wolverhampton, are terrorising old age pensioners who are going to try and cash their pension checks and so on and so forth. He knew that in one sense he could not use an outright appeal to racism and win sections of the working class and the lower middle class to his cause, which is basically immigration control and the repatriation, actually. That's what he called for, was the repatriation of black immigrants back to where they came from. He knew that he couldn't do that, partly actually because of World War II and the way in which, if you like, the logic of racism had led to the gas chamber. So we're only talking about 20 years after that horrendous, terrible event. He knew that he couldn't actually make a direct appeal to that kind of old-fashioned racism, but so he invented a new one, which is nature. Their culture is incompatible with ours. They can't really get on with our society. Really, they're a cancer, actually, at the heart of our society. Our way of life is being threatened by them. This is what he said time and time and time again. If you read his speeches, this is what he says. And you begin to see racism slipping over from outright calls of racial purity, which then becomes, if you like, the ideology of the Nazis, basically, and fascists. Really, that becomes, their kind of thing, anti-Semitism and so on and so forth. Actually, he says, it's their culture which is incompatible. And this is when we have a shift over, if you like, to the question of not race, but culture being the defining thing. That's what makes you an outsider. Now, in all of this, in terms of modern racism, what is the most important thing? The most important thing is a question of nation, of the nation state. The notion that there are some people who belong within the nation, who make up the nation, who may be rich, who may be poor, but you can identify as being part of the nation, and there are the others who really don't belong in the nation. And that's where you get, if you like, you get the merging of racism, xenophobia, anti-immigrant attacks, and the question of the borders. Who's coming, who's not coming. In other words, the emergence of the modern nation state is partly dependent upon there being some call to we belong, but they don't belong, which is clearly a cipher, if you like, for a call to race. It's what we call now the dog whistle racism. That notion of there's some people that belong, there's some people that don't, there's some people who are good, there's some people that are bad, there's something that unites the white boss and the white worker against the hordes who are just waiting on our borders. In other words, in one sense, the division of the world into nation states is a continual fuel and a continual tool in the hands of the racists. That's why socialists are internationalists at the end of the day. It is because we say that anyone should be able to go anywhere, absolutely. But it's also because we understand the role of the nation state in enforcing divisions between different groups of workers on the basis of this thing called a border and who belongs and who doesn't. Now, I'll just finish on this. If I was going to recommend one writer, apart from the Marxist canon, if you like, who really explains racism extremely well and how it operates actually on the ground, I would say it was W.E.B. Du Bois. He wrote 2 books which you should read. One is this little book called The Soul of Black Folk. The Soul of Black Folk. It's only a small book. It only costs about £6 or something like that. But to be honest, it's extremely interesting because what he does is W.E.B. Du Bois, he travels through the southern states of America in the early 20th century. This is published in 1903. And he looks at the condition of white workers in the segregated states of America, of the United States of America. And he looks at the position of blacks within that segregated society. And he makes one very interesting point. He says, these 2 groups, when you look at the plantation owners in the deep south of America, in these segregated states, they look on the poor whites and the blacks exactly the same. They treat them actually virtually the same. But what they offer to the white worker is you are part of humanity and you are better than them. And he says it gives the white worker a psychological wage. They don't get a real wage. You know, they might be slightly better off in terms of their wages in the factories in which they work. That's true, but not enough to keep them out of poverty. And they're despised, actually, by the plantation owners, the plantocracy, the ruling classes in southern states of America. Both the blacks and the poor whites are both despised in exactly the same way. And so he makes the same point that Marx makes in relation to the Irish in the 19th century in this country. And he says, these are 2 groups of workers who are really the same. But they are artificially kept apart by laws, yes, but by the pulpit. In other words, by church leaders who will speak to a white congregation and then only a white congregation and tell them that they are the inheritors of earth and keep the blacks out of the church and so on and so forth, by the bosses who divide and rule day in, day out and so on and so forth. But really, essentially, he says, these are the same groups of workers. And he says this, is that blacks have what he calls a double consciousness. We might, in Marxist terms, call it contradictory consciousness. He says the blacks, on one hand, in some states of America, the black worker hates himself, but and therefore wants to believe what the plantation owners say about him, that he's just a mule, that he's dirty, that he's of no value, that nothing will ever happen for him and his kids and so on and so forth. On one hand, the black worker wants to believe that, but on the other hand, he wants to assert his blackness, his notion that he's proud of who he is, that actually he does have a culture which is of value, he does have skills, he can contribute to humanity. And W.B. Du Bois says that is, if you like, the double consciousness which he calls the Negro in the southern states of America suffers under. And he says that the white worker also has a double consciousness. He knows at the end of the day, because he can see around him, that actually he doesn't really get the psychological wage, if you like, feeling better than the Negro, doesn't actually put food on the table. He understands that. But at the same time, he wants to believe the propaganda that he is somehow better than the Negro and somehow a step above and part of the white race and so on and so forth. And so he says, on both sides of the colour line is double consciousness. And it's exactly what Marx is saying. when he talks about the Irish in 19th century Britain. W.E.B. Du Bois talks about it in this. And in his next book, which is A Black Reconstruction in America, which was published in 1935, he goes even further. And he talks about, actually, the problem is not that white workers benefit from racism, quite the opposite. But actually, at the end of the day, their suffering is real. Therefore, in other words, to win them away from this notion that they are better, you have to somehow tackle the reason why they want to feel that they're better than the Negro. Why is it they want to feel, even though they don't get a material benefit from it? He says the only thing to do is a black worker and a white worker have to unite, and they have to fight for better conditions. If they do that, then they will understand that actually they're just workers. And actually they're despised by the bosses, whether they're black or they're white, or they're Polish, or they're Lithuanian, or they're Asian, or they're Muslim, or whatever it might be. So what I want to say in conclusion is this, is that actually when you look at the role of racism, it's, although it goes up and down according to the struggle and according to whether there's a fight against it. I mean, I always say this, if it hadn't been for Rock Against Racism and the Anti-Nazi League, London would not be the multicultural capital of the world. Right? So even though I had to live through Powellism, I also lived through the ANL and Rock Against Racism. And trust me, Hoxton would not be a place where you go down for a coffee, right? If the NF had won the Battle of the 1970s. Hoxton was a place you did not go if you had a brown or a black skin in the 1970s, because there's a family there there's a man there called Derek Day and his family, and he would bloody well drive you out by boots and knives if you had a black face nose. London is completely changed from my childhood, not because the bosses have engineered it from above, multicultural from above. Do not believe that for a minute. It's actually because we fought for this London which we have today. Always remember that. Always, and I can tell you that from my own lived experience, as they say in sociology. So that's important. The question of the struggle is important. But it's also, what's important is to understand this. The poor, what W.E.B. Du Bois was saying, the poor whites in the southern states of America are exploited. They do feel resentful. They do feel bitter. But they can't attack the bosses. So they attack the Negro who lives next door or in the neighbourhood next door. In other words, their bitterness is real. It's not imagined. They're not making it up. They haven't just got some kind of racist fervour that was just kind of landed on them like some kind of miasma. It comes out of the concrete conditions for their lives. So at the end of the day, if you want to unite black and white workers, you have to unite them around the betterment of the concrete conditions. Only then can we talk about actually pushing back racism and that fight for a better world which we're all involved in.
Okay, so now we're going to have plenty of time for discussion where people can contribute and ask questions. So what I would ask is if people could try and keep their contributions to 3 minutes maximum so we can get as many people contributing as possible. So if you'd like to speak, then please raise your hand to indicate and come up to this mic to speak. Yeah.
I'm interested in the way that racism based on skin has moved into cultural racism. Obviously it's happened, and you talk about Powell, but it obviously wasn't just one thing but part of a process. We had in the 70s, just thinking of some of the horrible television programs we had in the 70s, which is probably the first attempt at cultural racism. So, mind your language, isn't it funny what these Indians and Pakistanis are like? Or love your neighbour, wouldn't it be funny if a white person lived next door to a West Indian? Which which is not just based on skin colour. This is something which is starting to talk about culture. At the same time, you have phenomenon known, excuse the word, phenomenon known as Paki bashing. You have an organised thing before Blair Peach was killed called police nigger hunts, and the idea that it was acceptable to discriminate against people on the basis of their skin, which at the moment it isn't the same. And I think we're talking about a process which can take in not just events like Iranian Revolution, Satanic Verses, 9/11, but also the way in which the media and politicians have jumped on these and have recognised you cannot identify Pakistanis, Indians as being the problem, but something new, which is Muslims. And the question around this is obviously a phenomenon that's happened. This is the way in which race manifests itself isn't the same in the 60s. In what extent? I don't think there are a few white politicians and media owners that sit in a room with someone and saying, "Hey, you know what? Now let's blame the so we can't blame people on screen anymore. Let's blame the Muslims." At the same time, they obviously benefit from this sort of racism and they obviously reinforce it. You see Boris Johnson talking about pickaninnies. He knows what he's talking about when he's doing that, and there are obviously attempts by politicians, by media to fuel racism. The question I think is, to what extent is it a plan on their pan, and to what extent is it opportunist them reacting to changes in society?
Now, when you ask about to what extent is there a plan, I mean, I'd like to know where is this idea that Muslims or religious people in particular are homophobic, because this idea seems to be being pushed quite hard. I mean, I've been going to the TUC's LGBT conference, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender conference for a number of years, and 5 or 10 years ago there was actually quite a strong argument. When you went along, you saw people from African countries, from Jamaica, getting up and speaking. You saw people from the Middle East, and it seemed to be that there was a narrative going on that these countries are inherently homophobic because of their religion. And this seems to be something that's been quite consciously pushed. And yet, if you look on social media post of the Sun back in the 80s, talking about these loony left councils supporting gay people, and talking about Irish being over here when the pavements of Dublin and homeless when the pavements of Dublin are just the same as those of London. So you've got these papers now that claim that Muslims or maybe far right Christians are particularly homophobic, but particularly black ones. But then these papers were never the ones that supported LGBT people 30 years ago. So there's obviously a conscious change in the media to demonise religion and say it's homophobic, because for obviously to try and get LGBT people to demonise people on the basis of their religion. I mean, I'm glad to say, in terms of the TUC conference, we've actually won that argument, and there's no question about the need to unite LGBT oppressed people with Muslims in this country. No borders, no bigots, and the slogans that we've been using, and that's not questioned now. But there is still a big argument. That argument has seeped out into the wider public consciousness, and it is interesting, all these people who've never defended LGBT people before suddenly saying, well, Muslims are homophobic, and that's why we shouldn't allow, there's a problem with Muslims in this country. So I think that argument has been taken on the one amongst activists, but that argument is actually much more deep-seated, precisely because of people like Cameron, people like Blair, and the role of the media. And so the whole way that religion is now being demonised by people who are claiming to defend LGBT people who never showed the slightest bit of interest in us in the past. I think that was a conscious decision about 20 years ago, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We need a new bogeyman, and by the way, now that we're actually starting to be a bit more inclusive, people are seeing through the lies about being homophobic and transphobic and so on. Maybe we get these people on our side, and they will fight the Muslims for us, instead of actually saying we're all being oppressed and we need to unite against that. And it was great on Pride being with the LGBT plus against Islamophobia banner, and the reaction of the crowd when that banner went past, especially as the Tory bloc was right in front of the banner at some stage, and people were not too happy to see it. So there was a very good reaction to that. But I mean, I think there was a conscious decision to make this, to say that Muslims are particularly homophobic and so on, and that is something that we have to challenge.
one of the things that the referendum has revealed is that for a layer of people in society, immigration has become a lens that reflects all of their other discontents and anger that's been building up over 50 years. The decimation of British industry, the loss of decent paid jobs, the attacks on the unions, the attacks on council housing and so on. But what we have to say, I think, is that this is not something new. It's not a new phenomenon. If you think back to what Hass was saying about Enoch Powell in 1968, of course it was true that 68 was the high point of class struggle in France. It was also one of the lowest points in Britain when dockers, meat porters, construction workers all walked out on strike in support of Enoch Powell. It's actually a terrifying period for the left. But it's important to know that that situation changed. And it changed between 1968 and 1976, and it changed for two reasons. One is that Asian workers themselves proved that they were not prepared to be used as a cheap labour battering ram for capitalism against working class in general. The whole series of strikes, starting at Red Scar in 1966, but ending with Grunwick in 1976, 1977. But in between those two times, a whole series of strikes that proved the point. And it's very important because Grunwick's shows you by the end of that period that the argument that Asians could stand up and could fight back and weren't just simply cheap labour was something that was being won inside the working class. Why was it being won? It was won because Asians were fighting back, but also because there was an anti-racist minority inside the working class, black and white, that decided to make it an argument. We didn't duck the argument, didn't try and run away from it, even when it was hard, even when we were a minority. There were people who were prepared to stick their necks out and argue like dogs over the question, and they begin to win traction. So by 1977, when the Grunwicks called a mass picket, who's on the picket line? The Yorkshire miners, the Kent miners, the dockers who'd marched for Powell were there with their banner. And it's important because what it says is, if you fight, not only do you prove your validity and your ability not to just be a victim of capitalism, but also you prove to yourself and to others that we could, by uniting, well, this is the only way to make real progress. Hundreds and thousands of people saw Grunwick, and after that could no longer believe the idea that your Asian worker was simply a dupe at the hands of the bosses. Now, I think that is a battle that we have to recall, because the same thing is happening now. The question of Eastern Europeans and whether they're being used to drive down their wages, there's no shortcuts to this. We have to be the people who argue about it, but they themselves have to be the people who fight over this question. There has to be new organisation that involves Eastern European workers, showing that they're not prepared to be used and abused, and on that basis I think we can smash them the same way as we smashed them last time.
Can we have this lady first here? So there's loads of people who want to speak, so if everyone can try and keep their contributions to 2 minutes. I'm going to tap on the table when you've gone over, yeah?
Okay. Following on from that, really, I think in terms of looking now on how the state uses racism, I think what's quite interesting as well is the way they use anti-racism as well, isn't there? So you've got massive attacks on Jeremy Corbyn for being anti-Semitic, and somehow by the same people who are demonising Muslims, who do nothing to fight anti-Semitism, who've done nothing to fight racism. It seems to me that there's a tremendous legacy in this country from the Anti-Nazi League, from Unite Against Fascism, from Stand Up to Racism and other organisations that has set a tone. I mean, when I was a kid, certainly people did used to stand up, and in the Powell era, and go, I'm proud to be racist. Actually, people are falling over themselves. My daughter built a Stand Up to UKIP at Essex University, and she said, when she talked to, part of that was about pulling people away from UKIP, and when she talked to the people who thought they supported UKIP, they were busy going, well, I'm not racist, and so the tone has changed, I think. Now, I think there's a fair amount of scaremongering going on, I think, and not surprisingly, the racist attacks are absolutely appalling, and we have to be absolutely vigilant at the moment, I think. But this sort of pessimism that I see certainly on social media, where people are going, well, there's going to be concentration camps next week, that doesn't seem to be my experience. The racist attacks, though awful, though horrible, and though vicious, are isolated, it seems to me. They're isolated individuals, and you compare that to when the EDL came out en masse on the streets after the death of Lee Rigby, and we had to respond en masse in quite a different sort of way. It does seem to be different to me. So I think there is a discussion around that, because I see certainly sections of the left who are panicking and saying that actually racism is everywhere as a result of the Leave vote, that there is this sort of, personally I think, mythical white working class that is totally racist, it's entrenched, but not offering any answers at all. Whereas it seems to me that what the Speaker said about, linking the fight back against austerity, the absolute important thing for us is the demonstration on the 16th of July, which does say, no to austerity, no to racism, and actually kick the fucking Tories out.
Hi everybody. About racism and discrimination, I have a bad story in my house in Barnsley. We live in house, 8 guys from different country, from Sudanese and Eritrea. And the girl, he care about my house. Every time he's come and abuse my friend. The problem, my friend cannot understand the language. Only just me, I speak the language. One day when I come to my house, I find he abuse my friend. And he said something, I don't remember, strong. And my friend, he said to her, okay, you are good. He didn't understand what he said to him. And after that, when he go outside, he said to me, why to say? I told her, Julia, don't say it like this to my friend. You must respect my friend. I don't do anything for you. Just respect my friend. The problem of my friend in house, he don't understand. When someone you abuse him or so something bad for him, he cannot understand because the language is different. It's come from different country. He cannot speak the language. This is the problem. And I want to say, the people, he don't accept my color. I'm not created myself. And it's not important to be white or black. It's important to be your heart is clean. That's important for everything. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to something in what Hass was talking about the Marxist definition of racism and how, in a way, it's nothing much to do with race. It started out, as he went through in some depth, about being against black people, but then get onto a great hierarchy of ways where you could discriminate against all sorts of people. So the racism that he was talking about in the 19th century in Britain was against other white people, and obviously one of the main racisms that has developed through history is anti-Semitism, which has not been specifically against black people. And I think it's interesting because people tend to talk about white and black racism, whereas actually there's been a long history of racism which is directed by the ruling class against all sorts of people. I was very fascinated by reading about American racism in the 20s. I've just got a quote here from this guy called Kenneth Roberts, who was a popular journalist who wrote a book called Why Europe Leaves Home, which was about, as he put it, the American nation was founded and developed by the Nordic race, the Aryans, whatever. He goes on about the problem now is if a few more million members of the Alpine, Mediterranean and Semitic races, that's 3 different races, keep pouring in, the result will be blah, blah, blah. I really don't want to read most of this out. A race of good-for-nothing mongrels. And his point is that we will no longer have the kind of capitalism that you have in America. Now, one of the things that I think the American ruling class has been particularly good at through its history is dividing different sets of people, different sets of immigrants against each other with precisely this kind of racism at its most extreme being what Hass was talking about in the American South. But it's something that can always be challenged. Luckily, it has sometimes been challenged in America, but in Britain, it's been challenged again and again. And I think that, following on from some of the stuff that Yuri was just saying, one of the things that's shocking is this idea that you have whole sections of the country have become so racist that you can't go into them. I just recall, this is the advantage of having been around in the past in previous anti-racist struggles, that the times again and again we were told you can't go to the Isle of Dogs. I remember before campaigning the Isle of Dogs, they're all racists there, there's no point. More recently, you can't go to Barking, there's all racists there, there's no point. And because we had the kind of politics that we've been talking about here that says that's not what racism is about, we went there and we fought and actually were able to make a difference and push the Nazis and the racists back. So I think it's vital that we have some kind of theory like we're discussing here that says you can beat the racists.
Yeah, comrades, I just want to follow on from this the kind of concern that has been raised over the last few days about racism in the wake of the exit vote, because it's largely characterised, isn't it, as really kind of ignorant, working class, probably northern people who are too stupid to know what they were doing. And I think it's important for one thing to let's remind ourselves and remind people like David Cameron, who were saying that this is outrageous and we should remember that these people have made a wonderful contribution to our society. They have, but of course the same David Cameron who was demonising Sadiq Khan and who fuelled the racism of the referendum campaign. On one hand, let's remember, racism has never gone away. I was talking to a group of black workers here in Camden this week, and they were reminding me of the racism, the more common racism that they experience on a systematic basis, the institutional racism at the hands of the bosses. The systematic racism that means less likely to be offered decent jobs, less likely to be promoted, more likely to be the first person out of the door, more likely to live in poor areas. And this is something that has sharpened and deepened precisely as a result of the recession and austerity that has been imposed upon us by the bosses. So let's remember that institutional racism never went away, and it was the bosses who were responsible. But yes, of course, there has been an increase in racism. But again, not just over the last couple of weeks or so, not over the last week. Actually, the respected British Social Attitude Survey has spoken about an increase in racial prejudice for 15 or 16 years, after a period when kind of systematically people were expressing anti-racism and opposition to racial prejudice. We should not be surprised that those surveys have shown a different attitude over the last 15 years. Why? Because the last 15 years has been the period in which systematically Islamophobia in particular has been stoked up by the politicians and the press, stoking it up, demonising Muslims and sowing and creating that division. The point is for us, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to challenge it? How are we going to campaign against it? And that's precisely why things like we keep banging on about it, but the demonstration on the 16th of July is so hugely important, and that the strikes next week are so important, because if there's going to be protest amongst teachers in schools, if there's going to be continual defence of the National Health Service and so on, what are those picket lines, what are those protests going to look like? They have to look like modern Britain, which means that they have people from all over the globe on those demonstrations, on those protests. And the more that we do that kind of thing, the more we strengthen our side, the more we show who the real enemy is and who we need to fight against and who are our allies and comrades in that struggle.
Yes, I just wanted to pick up on something that that Hassan said about the socialist idea that we, as socialists, we oppose any migration controls. We say everyone should be able to cross the border and go anywhere. And it seems to me that this is becoming a fantastically important line to draw in the sand, really, because apart from anything else, this is what the rebels in the Labour Party, the backstabbers who are trying to get Corbyn at the moment, really hate about him, is that he has so far he has refused to be drawn or to compromise on the issue of migration. So so far he has said there should be no upper limit on migration. And they want him to stop there. They want him to not say that. You've got people, commentators like Polly Toynbee and so on, in The Guardian. You've got people who are, especially in the Labour Party, who want to make these compromises and to be drawn onto the territory of the racists. And I wanted to talk about a demonstration we had in Bristol on the day that on the 24th, the day the referendum result came out. We had a rally of about 400 people in the centre of Bristol, chanting "Refugees are welcome here," and we drew enough people into this to go on a march. We marched around the city centre. We marched up one of the main streets in the centre of the city, and it was. There was a lot of sort of faint hearts before this. Can we do this? Can we pull it? I was amazed and delighted by the reaction that we got. We were really shouting very, very loudly. All the taxi drivers were hooting us and supporting us. At one point, a young white guy leaned out of the bus, massive, great full bus, with his fist clenched. And I thought, oh, Lord, what's he going to say? He was cheering us, and the people on the bus were cheering us. It was fantastic. A woman came down from an upstairs window. She'd been waving. She came down. She marched all the way back to the centre with me. She said, I just had to leave my work and join this march, So, and there were lots of people. We got bigger and bigger as we went along. So actually, there were probably people on that march joined it, who some of them thought, well, you've got to have some controls. But we have to unite with them and have big, flamboyant, noisy events like that and draw people in and say no migration controls. And that's actually part of defending Corbyn as well.
Hi everyone, just a quick one from me. I'm Danny, I'm one of the organisers of LGBT+ Against Islamophobia, which Merlin mentioned. Hi Merlin. I just wanted to let you all know basically what we are doing to get out onto the streets and interact with people, and to invite you all to get involved as well, because LGBT+ Against Islamophobia is a group that's open to everybody, regardless of sexuality and religion. We had our first official meeting quite recently, and we agreed in that that our priority was grassroots engagement with people from the Muslim community and broader communities as well, people who are propagating the Islamophobia which we're fighting. So we're inspired really by Lesbians and Gays Support the Migrants in the absolute root of unconditional solidarity. So we are prepared to offer our solidarity to people in the Muslim community, to people in communities where apparently racism is inherent from white working class communities. We are prepared to offer them our solidarity whether they want it or not. And that's why we're going to be going to talk to them, to meet them, and to push forward the ideas that we've all been talking about in this meeting, so that they can hopefully join us in our struggle to argue for and to fight for fair conditions, fair living conditions, fair working conditions, and so on for everybody. So if you want to know more, find us on Facebook, come talk to me. I'll be around over the weekend. I'm quite recognisable. So I just wanted to say that, and to thank you all for your support, which I know you give.
Final speaker. I know I couldn't get everyone in, I'm afraid, but we've got to finish the meeting at some point.
I want to just raise the question of collective strength and why it's important. Because if you look at when the EDL tried to march in East London, one of the most important things happened was where the tube workers refused to open the tubes, and then therefore the EDL got put on a hooligan train right outside of London. In other words, are broken because the majority of those workers were not Muslim or black. Actually, the majority of those workers were white, actually, and it was a question, and it started from that strength. And I tell you why that's important, because when you talk about Sadiq Khan and you talk about another person called Trevor Phillips, I've been involved in a row with them in the aftermath of what happened. Trevor Phillips has been arguing this is inevitable because we're sleepwalking into segregation. And the reason why I raised the question of class, because he started off living in poverty somewhere in the lower part of North London, and he's now ended up in Hampstead with a 5-bedroom house. Do you know what I mean? And as he's gone up, he's got worse. Do you know what I mean? In terms of the hill. And so class matters in terms of both in the way that it shapes the articulation of how you resist it. And he's the person they put on television. He's the person in The Guardian justifying attacking socialist ideas about the question about collective strength versus collection strength. And it matters. Who's the person that Sadiq Khan and the group of people have drawn in around them in order to argue about what to do in London? You see, it matters that Sadiq Khan says that the tube workers should accept that there's going to be extended hours, and they have to accept the cuts that are taking place. So the reason why class and race is important is to both understand how we begin to organise the fight. You see, W. Du Bois said the question of the 20th century was going to be the colour line, the institutional nature of the way that racism organised, and he was right. And he organised an organisation called the NACCP. In other words, you've had a black president, haven't you? You've seen the institutional breakdown through the civil rights movement. I'm not arguing that racism has gone away, but what I'm arguing is that it's important to understand the conscious efforts to break down racism led by socialists matters. I know Phil didn't get in about Rotherham, but I tell you, in Rotherham, we had to face at least 40 demonstrations where the EDL came down under the worst conditions in terms of questions of child abuse and various other things. But in the end, we were able to break the EDL, but something else happened. The Muslim community itself, the reason why the Rotherham 12 was speaking at the rally before was because the two things came together. The confidence of working class people to see some collective thing came out a bit in terms of it was the police to blame, but also the black and Muslim community felt that they could come out onto the street together in confidence. The two things have to merge together. And I tell you, on the 16th of July, we've got a task because there's a fork in the road. We could go back to the 70s that has talked about, or we could go forward to something else. Because I tell you, the most pissed off people are both black and white, and that could be used to explode into something else, about both against austerity and racism. This could be, it's a problem, they've raised it, but they may not come to a solution, and all of us are part of that solution, and having a revolutionary party that can shape that is going to make a difference to both how we fight now in terms of, and how we change that, and I'll stop there.
Before I bring Hassan back in, I'd just like to let everybody know that there are loads of publications and books that Hassan has edited and written, and he's written articles in, and they're all available over there on that bookmark stall, or you can get them at the actual bookmarks pop-up shop near the canteen. So I'm going to bring Hassan back in to sum up.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, actually, I'm not trying to promote myself because clearly I don't get any money from bookmarks publications, but British, if you haven't not read it, British Black Rebels is fairly good, yeah? It's all right, yeah? Because it goes through 300 years of black leadership of working class struggle in this country. And if you don't know that history, you need to know that history. So find out about it one way or another, even if you don't buy that pamphlet. Just a couple of things. Firstly, all the attacks which are happening at the moment, and clearly there's been a spike in attacks, hasn't there, that's happened since the referendum, where basically hardened scumbag racists have thought that they now had permission to go onto the streets and attack whoever they wanted to, indiscriminately. Because you hear about, it's not just people who are supposedly identified as being from Eastern Europe, but people who are blonde and blue eyes and 6 foot who they think might be Eastern European or women in hijabs or whoever it might be. I mean, there's just been indiscriminate. Because of course, racism is irrational, indiscriminate in that sense, right? That has clearly been happening, and it's absolutely appalling. But I would say this to the people who, if you like, think that racism somehow just invented yesterday, or actually, if you want to do something about the antagonism between Eastern European workers and workers from other migrant communities and so on and so forth, which is clearly happening in some areas of this country and so on and so forth. Actually, you know what you should do? You should go to the warehouses which circle London. You should go to the big combines like Amazon and all the distribution centres, Tesco's, Sainsbury's, Waitrose, you name it, all these respectable, nice people, yeah, who own all these businesses because they know what they're doing. The reason why they wanted to stay in the EU is because they understood that they could get cheap labour from poorer countries and Europe, and they could use it to undercut native labour in a way that they haven't been able to do in the present period. They know exactly what they're doing. So when actually, if you want to do something actually about anti-Polish or anti-migrant racism, actually you need to start organising those factories. We need to have a campaign against 0 hours contracts. We need to have campaigns in the unions, serious campaigns, not token campaigns, serious campaigns to stop the casualisation of the workforce. Because these antagonisms are not just imagined in the heads of people, they're real. But it's to do with the real things which are happening. Real things are happening. No, if you go into warehouses, I know in the part of London that I live, they are staffed by, if you like, indigenous white working class, Africans, ex-asylum seekers, people from Eastern Europe, from all parts of the world, from South America. You know, the people who are drawn into the great metropolis either by because they're drawn for the prospect of work or they've been pushed out of their own country. These are the people who have been exploited day in, day out by the bosses. And clearly the bosses want this kind of harmonisation of labour, as they call it, across the whole of the EU. That's why I voted, actually, for us to leave the EU, because I understood, actually, the EU is forcing down the living standards and the wages of workers across the EU, and they don't give a damn about the consequences. They don't give a damn about the social explosion that might happen in one country or another. They don't give a damn actually about Le Pen or the anti-migrant or anti-Muslim forces which are organising themselves across Europe. They don't give a damn about that as long as the profits are there at the end of the day, right? That's what we have to understand. That's why these antagonisms are not imagined. They're real, and that's why we have to go to the roots of them. If you're really serious actually about tackling racism and driving back racism and trying to unite workers. But clearly, you'd have to be an idiot not to understand that racism is not welling up from the bottom of society. Racism has been cascading down from the top of society for years and years and years. I mean, I see these things on my Facebook. The Daily Express front pages over 30 days. All of them, the most naked appeal to racism you could ever imagine. I mean, it is mind-bending actually when you look at that. When you look at the screws on Muslims around legislation, state racism, legislation around Muslims and prevent and so on and so forth, and trying to use public sector workers basically as spies for the state and so on and so forth. They're ratcheting up. There's another one going through Parliament now, if they get it through. I don't know. Do you know what I mean? That is all coming down from the top of society. It's not been invented by poor people in Durham or bloody Northampton or West Wales or wherever it is. And also, I looked at the figures. The top 9 poorest districts in the whole of the EU, out of the top 10 poorest districts in the whole of the EU, 9 are in England and Wales. The top 9 are in England and Wales. There's one, I think, in Belgium somewhere. But the rest of them are places like West Wales, Durham, northeast, northwest, the east of England, Boston and Lincolnshire and so on and so forth. These are real problems. If you really want to do something about racism, you have to do something about those problems. Just a question of, I think the comrades are right when they're talking about, why socialists argue for the free movement of the people. I have to say this, actually, when the British had an empire, I know the ruling class is suffering from the fact that they really don't have an empire. They pretend that they do have an empire, and that's actually part, in one sense, of the rhetoric around it. We could be great again. Yeah, you wish. Actually, when they did have an empire, there were millions upon millions upon millions of citizens of that empire who had the automatic right to come and live in Britain. Did they come? No, they didn't. A very, very tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of them came, which is the Windrush generation and the people that came after that. Really? Because people don't uproot themselves in their countries just because they think they're going to earn an extra £2 an hour in a bloody warehouse in frickin' South London. I'm sorry, no. People want to stay and build their lives with their families where they live. And during most of the British Empire, when almost millions of people had British passports, a tiny minority actually made their way to this country. Why? Because the work wasn't here. So what's the bloody point? In other words, when you look at actually the movement of people, unless it's a forced migration of people, like we've seen in Syria, for example, if throughout history you look at the migration of people, particularly under the period of late industrial capitalism, people move to where there's work. it does not work, people don't move. Because why would you? It doesn't make any sense. It's not like, it's such a nirvana to live in Britain in the 21st century, for God's sake, that you'd actually, just out of to choose to come here. It's a nonsense, So, one is people distribute themselves across the globe according to their need and according to the ability of a particular area to be able to feed and nourish them and their families. That's it. And that's what we understand as socialists. That's what's happened throughout human history. It's not going to be any different now as it is in the future. That is the way it will be. That's why we say no borders. But we also say no borders because we understand that borders are divisions between people. The divisions between people that our rulers put there to try and differentiate us from them and try and bind them to us, as it were. The notion that we have some kind of national interest. When it comes to homophobia and Muslims, I would say that clearly there's homophobia within the Muslim community. I mean, you can't paint a picture and say that's not true. But of course, yes, it is true of other communities. But also, actually, if you look at the way that Islam is interpreted, clearly, like Christians and other groups, actually there is a prohibition against a general prohibition against lesbians and gays and so on and so forth, right? It's clearly there. But I would say this, is that, one, I think it's basically generational. I think attitudes are really changing very, very fast, as you would imagine, because actually what happens when people, what people begin to, if you like, assimilate into a culture, they begin to take those, there's a pressure, if you like, on the Muslim community, but especially amongst young Muslims, to actually say, no, actually homophobia is wrong, and we don't want it as part of our religious philosophy, if you like. It's clearly that is going on, and actually the organisation that Danny's organising stuff is so important, because actually it's saying, actually, you could be LGBTI and you could be against Islamophobia. In other words, actually, we're your friends, actually, whether you like it or not, which I think actually is a good start for an argument, yeah? But there's lots of Muslims, especially young Muslims within the Muslim communities, who are actually coming out, especially post-Orlando, actually, who actually thought, actually, because of the kind of wave of sympathy and the anger and despair around the Orlando massacre, are actually beginning to come out. And I think, it's particularly in my organisation, the Muslim Institute, there's lots of people who are gay, lesbian, and transgender, actually. And we're perfectly accepting of it. I'm not saying that we're representative, but that process is going on. I looked at the figures, actually. You're more likely to suffer a violent homophobic attack on a Saturday night in the London Borough of Sutton than you are in Tower Hamlets, frankly. Because of white, sort of, actually middle-class drunken thugs, actually, who basically beat up gay people just for sport. And they do that. I mean, I know that because I used to live in Sutton for quite a long time. I don't know what kind of place that is on a Saturday night. I looked at the figures, it's true. You're more likely to be beaten up in Sutton than you are in Tower Hamlets if you suffer a violent homophobic attack. So let's take that into account. Lastly, the question of Asian workers, the history of Asian workers. As Yuri said, it's very, very interesting history, actually. And he's right, it started in the early 1960s around struggles between Asian workers in the mills in the north of England. And then there's lots of different disputes that took place throughout the country, ended in 1976 in the massive Grunwicks trade union battle in west of London, 1976-1977, which produced this leader, Jabin Desai, most wonderful working class heroine we've had in recent times. But actually, there are all sorts of arguments along the way. For example, at the beginning of these disputes, the trade union officials wouldn't support the Asian workers. And they allowed white racist workers to call the shots in these disputes. And lots of these disputes actually failed because the Asian workers weren't supported by the trade union. There had to be a battle inside the trade unions to say, no, if Asian workers go on strike and they pay their subs, you have to represent them. And you have to conduct a political argument within the workforce as to why the white workers should also support them. And that was an argument that was carried out over at least a decade and a half, I think, until we come to the point today where we think it just is that the trade unions support workers of all colours and all faiths and all ethnicities. We just think that's just what they do. It wasn't always the case. Someone had to fight for it. And actually, I'll tell you who fought for it. Actually, it was the Asian workers themselves, who refused to be separated off and isolated, and also socialists who intervened from the outside into those factories. Actually, they said, actually, we support you, the Asian workers, and we're going to take the argument to the white workers. We're not going to allow the National Front supporting workers to actually isolate the Asian workers. And my God, you trade union bureaucrats, if you don't support these Asian workers, we're going to make sure you get thrown out, right? And at the end of that, I'll tell you what happened was you had a black president of the TUC. That was the end of that struggle. I mean, it wasn't the only outcome of it. Like I say, actually, it modernised the British trade unions to be multiracial, anti-racist, and anti-racist force in society in one sense. But one thing came out of it was actually you had a black TUC president. No one even thought 20 years previous to that you'd have a black guy from the TNG would actually run the TUC. It wasn't particularly good, but it was an achievement. It was useless, yeah. But it was an achievement in the sense that what he represented was a struggle that went on in the trade unions that said everyone who pays their subs, who's working class, who works in a workplace, must be represented by the trade union, and that united we stand, divided we fall. We take it as common sense now, but someone had to fight for it. And this is a fight we're all going to be engaged in the future.